For 125 years, France ruled Chad. Not officially, but through its military presence, its economic grip, and its quiet control over the country's leaders. It seemed like an unbreakable system. But on January 31st, 2025, something happened that no one thought possible. French troops were expelled. That alone would have been shocking, but what came next shook the entire continent. Chad's leader, Mahamat Idriss Déby, didn't just celebrate their departure. He revealed explosive details about why France was there, how it had been controlling Chad's resources, and what the country plans to do next. Is this just the story of one African nation, or is this the beginning of the biggest anti-colonial revolution in modern history? What did Deby reveal that sent shockwaves through Africa? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community, and if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. Chad's relationship with France wasn't always this tense. For decades, the two countries maintained military agreements that allowed France to station troops in Chad under the justification of fighting insurgency. The arrangement was sold as a security partnership, with France presenting itself as a protector, helping Chad combat violent groups. On paper, this seemed like a necessary alliance, but on the ground, the reality was far different. Many in Chad began to see French troops as occupiers rather than allies. While France claimed to be protecting Chad from insurgencies, critics pointed out that its presence appeared more about maintaining control than providing real security. The numbers didn't add up. If French troops were truly in Chad to fight insurgency, why did insurgent attacks continue to increase? Why were major regions under French military watch still vulnerable to raids, bombings, and kidnappings? Instead of being eliminated, groups were getting stronger, launching more sophisticated attacks despite the so-called French protection. One of the most devastating examples was the 2015 attack in N'Djamena, Chad's capital, where bombers killed nearly 40 people and injured over 100. The attack took place just kilometers away from French military installations, raising the question, if French forces were there to secure Chad, how could such a deadly attack happen in the heart of the capital? The government imposed emergency measures, but the violence didn't stop. Then came 2019, when militants carried out another brutal attack on Chad's Boma Peninsula, killing nearly 100 Chadian soldiers. This was one of the deadliest attacks in Chad's history, and it happened despite years of French military presence in the region. Many Chadians asked, if foreign troops couldn't prevent such a large-scale massacre, what was their purpose? The problem wasn't just isolated attacks. It was that the entire security situation in the Sahel was getting worse, not better. Despite France's so-called anti-insurgency efforts, jihadist groups continued to expand their reach, destabilizing Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Instead of weakening over time, insurgent organizations seemed to be growing more coordinated and emboldened, launching cross-border attacks and taking control of entire villages. This fueled widespread suspicion. If France had thousands of troops in Chad and access to high-tech military surveillance, why were insurgents still able to operate so freely? Many in Chad started questioning whether France was truly invested in defeating insurgency, or if it was using the crisis as an excuse to keep a military grip on Africa. The security narrative was crumbling, and the anti-French movement in Chad started gaining momentum. Protests erupted, with thousands demanding an end to French military presence, arguing that Chad needed self-sufficiency, not foreign troops. The sentiment was clear. If Chad was going to fight insurgency, it needed to do so on its terms, without foreign interference. The message reached Mahamat Idriss Déby, and when the moment came, he made his decision. The French military was no longer welcome. Chad was taking back its sovereignty. At the same time, a larger movement was sweeping across West Africa, shaking the foundations of France's military presence in the region. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had already expelled French troops, citing the same reasons: broken promises, lack of real security improvements, and the growing realization that France was only protecting its strategic interests rather than genuinely helping African nations fight insurgency. Mali had been the first to take a bold stance in 2022, expelling the Barkhane forces, France's largest military operation in Africa, after years of failed counterinsurgency efforts. Burkina Faso followed in 2023, demanding the withdrawal of French troops from its soil, as it sought to forge new security partnerships with Russia and other allies who were willing to work on more equal terms. Niger, despite being home to one of France's most critical military bases, joined the movement in 2023, rejecting its role as a French outpost and aligning itself with the growing wave of anti-colonial sentiment. This regional shift placed Chad in an increasingly difficult position. It had long been considered France's most reliable ally in Central Africa, hosting French forces for decades and serving as a strategic military hub. But with its neighbors cutting ties with France one by one, Chad found itself standing alone. The question became unavoidable. Could it remain the last major African ally still hosting French forces? Or was it time to make the same bold move? The pressure wasn't just coming from neighboring nations, it was coming from within Chad itself. Protest movements, political groups, and ordinary citizens were demanding answers. The younger generation in particular saw the departure of French forces from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger as a sign that Africa could stand on its own, free from foreign military control. The demand for sovereignty was no longer just talk. It was becoming a political reality across the region.
Nous voulons à ce que la France stoppe maintenant.
We want France to stop now. Our country is not a monarchy. It's not a dictatorship. We want a pure and simple transition. We don't want the Transitional Military Council. We don't want France's interference in our daily lives.
C'est de la monarchie.
Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Deby knew that Chad couldn't afford to be left behind. Expelling France wasn't just a national decision, it was about standing in solidarity with a broader African movement rejecting foreign military interference. It was about taking control of Chad's future before France could decide it for them. So, the troops were finally forced out of Chad. But it didn't end there. Expelling French troops was a political earthquake, but what Deby said afterwards shook the ground even more. For years, the common belief was that African nations could not survive without European military assistance. The idea was simple. Western forces were necessary to keep insurgent groups at bay and maintain stability. But Deby challenged that idea completely. He announced that Chad would strengthen its military without relying on France. This statement was more than just words. It was a direct rejection of Western narratives that portray African countries as militarily weak and dependent. Other African countries had already proven this was possible. When Mali cut ties with France, it partnered with Russia to bolster its military capabilities. Burkina Faso and Niger did the same, proving that local forces, when properly trained and equipped, could handle security threats without Western troops. Deby also spoke about revamping Chad's military industry, investing in defense production, modernizing its equipment, and ensuring that Chad's security decisions would be made in Chad, not in Paris. He made it clear, no foreign army will ever dictate how Chad protects itself. This announcement sent shockwaves through Africa. If Chad could do this, what was stopping other nations? But for other nations to consider kicking France out, they need to know what Deby said about France. The extent of France's grip on Chad became clear when Deby described how French military bases weren't just strategic outposts for counterinsurgency, they were power centers, ensuring that Chad's sovereignty remained in name only. These bases gave France more than just military leverage. They provided direct influence over Chad's political decisions, economic affairs, and even leadership transitions. It was no secret that French-backed politicians had historically been favored in Chad's government, with any leader who dared to challenge France's authority either pressured into submission or swiftly removed. One of Deby's most shocking admissions was how France dominated Chad's oil industry, an industry that should have been the backbone of Chad's economic independence, but instead remained a tool for French enrichment. For decades, Chad was sitting on vast oil reserves, yet its people saw little benefit from it. This was no accident. French energy companies had secured deeply exploitative contracts, written in a way that ensured Chad remained dependent on France while Paris reaped the bulk of the profits. Deby revealed how Chad's oil was extracted by French-owned corporations, exported to Europe for refining, and then sold on international markets at prices dictated by France. The wealth generated from Chad's land rarely returned in full. Instead, it funded the economic ambitions of a foreign power. This arrangement started in the early 2000s when Chad's oil production was first commercialized. Major Western energy giants like TotalEnergies, formerly Total, backed by French political influence, gained control over key oil fields. Deals were signed where the vast majority of profits flowed back to the parent companies, while Chad's government was left with only a minimal percentage of revenue. On paper, these contracts were structured as investments to help develop Chad's economy. But in reality, they ensured long-term dependence on foreign oil firms while restricting Chad's ability to manage its resources. The biggest flaw in this system was how little refining infrastructure Chad was allowed to develop. Instead of processing its crude oil, Chad was forced to export nearly all of it to European refineries, mostly in France, and then buy back finished petroleum products at inflated prices. This meant that despite being an oil-rich country, Chad still had to import fuel, gasoline, and other refined petroleum products at rates set by European markets. Even when Chad attempted to negotiate better terms for its oil, it faced enormous political and financial pressure. French-backed financial institutions, including the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, exerted influence over Chad's economy by tying loans and development aid to continued cooperation with French oil companies. Attempts to renegotiate oil contracts were met with resistance, as France and its corporate allies ensured that any efforts to nationalize Chad's oil sector were blocked. Deby's revelations exposed this deep-rooted exploitation, making it clear that France wasn't just profiting from Chad's oil. It was deliberately keeping Chad dependent on a system that favored French corporations at every level. His statements were a wake-up call, signaling that Chad was no longer willing to serve as an economic colony where its resources funded a foreign power. Beyond oil, Deby pointed out that France had long maintained a firm grip over Chad's financial system, exerting control that extended far beyond military presence or resource exploitation. One of the most glaring examples of this economic stranglehold was the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African nations, including Chad, but still tied to the French treasury. This system, inherited from colonial rule, allowed France to maintain direct influence over Chad's economy, despite the country gaining formal independence in 1960. The CFA franc was created in 1945 as a colonial currency, designed to keep French territories financially linked to Paris. Even after decolonization, the system remained intact, ensuring that African economies stayed deeply dependent on French financial institutions. While supporters of the CFA franc claimed it provided monetary stability, critics, including Deby, argued that it was a neo-colonial tool that kept African nations from achieving full economic sovereignty. The core issue was how the CFA franc was controlled. The currency was pegged to the euro, meaning that Chad couldn't set its monetary policy. Instead, the French treasury held reserves for CFA franc countries, requiring them to store at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France. This meant that a significant portion of Chad's wealth remained under French supervision, limiting the government's ability to invest freely in its development projects. This financial arrangement had devastating consequences for Chad's economy. Whenever France made financial decisions affecting the CFA franc, Chad had no say in the matter. If France devalued the currency, as it did in 1994, causing the CFA franc to lose 50% of its value overnight, African economies like Chad suffered immediate inflation, increased import costs, and economic instability. Such moves disproportionately hurt Chad, a country that relied heavily on imports for basic goods, including food, medicine, and fuel. Deby's statement made it clear that Chad's financial policies were still being dictated from Paris rather than N'Djamena, reinforcing the idea that France's influence wasn't just military or political, it was deeply embedded in Chad's economy. This financial dependency also meant that Chad had limited room to negotiate trade deals on its terms. Any attempt to shift alliances or move towards new economic partners was met with pushback from France, which still wielded financial leverage over the country through international loans, aid programs, and banking regulations tied to the CFA system. The result was an artificial financial leash that kept Chad from fully exercising its economic freedom. Even when the government wanted to invest in infrastructure, social programs, or industrial projects, it had to navigate French-controlled financial systems to access its own money. This ensured that France's role in Chad's economy remained dominant, long after direct colonial rule had ended. Déby's revelations about France's control over Chad's currency sent a powerful message that true independence could never be achieved as long as France controlled the nation's money. If Chad was serious about reclaiming its sovereignty, breaking free from the CFA franc would be just as important as removing French troops from its territory. The biggest bombshell of all was Déby's confirmation that France wasn't just using Chad for military convenience. It was exploiting the country's wealth to maintain its economic advantage. French military forces weren't in Chad solely for the fight against insurgency. They were also there to protect French business interests. The military bases that were supposed to defend Chad ended up defending France's economic empire. Déby's speech wasn't just a declaration of sovereignty, it was a moment of reckoning. Chad wasn't just kicking out French troops, it was exposing a century-old system designed to keep Africa subservient. The military departure was only the first step. The next question was whether Chad would also break free from France's economic grip. Now that French troops were gone, the next step was clear. Chad would have to decide whether to cut economic ties as well. But will Chad survive without France? Many critics, especially in Western media and financial institutions, warned that Chad would struggle without France's economic backing. The common argument was that Chad's economy was too fragile, too reliant on French aid and investment, and that without French oversight, it would spiral into financial chaos. France itself had used this reasoning in the past to justify its continued influence over former colonies, framing its presence as essential to stability and economic growth. But Deby was prepared with a counterplan, one that didn't involve returning to old colonial ties or begging for Western financial assistance. He pointed out that Chad had other partners willing to invest in the country's future without the baggage of neocolonialism. The departure of French troops didn't mean Chad would be left isolated. It meant Chad was finally free to choose its allies, and those allies were already lining up. Russia, China, Turkey, and the UAE had already begun discussions about strengthening trade relations, investing in infrastructure, and supporting Chad's economic independence. These nations saw Chad as a strategic partner, not just another country to exploit for resources. Unlike France, which had extracted Chad's wealth for decades while offering minimal development, these new allies promised mutual benefit and equal partnerships. China, which has been making massive infrastructure investments across Africa, expressed interest in funding major projects in Chad, including roads, railways, and energy facilities, something France had failed to prioritize despite its long presence in the country. Russia, already working closely with Mali and Burkina Faso, had shown interest in security cooperation and industrial development, ensuring that Chad's military and economic sectors could grow without dependence on Western support. Turkey, an emerging power in African diplomacy, had been expanding trade and construction projects across the continent, while the UAE saw Chad as a gateway to deeper investments in Africa's resource markets. Instead of relying on French aid, Deby announced plans to develop local industries, invest in agriculture, and take full control of Chad's oil production. This meant shifting away from an economic model where Chad simply extracted raw materials and sent them abroad, and instead focusing on processing and refining its resources within its borders. If Chad could build its oil refineries, industrial plants, and manufacturing hubs, it could stop depending on foreign companies to do the work it could do itself. Other African nations had already proven that this was possible. Burkina Faso provided a strong example. After cutting ties with France, it quickly secured alternative economic partnerships and started its ambitious industrialization projects. It looked to Russia and China for new deals, while also expanding its domestic agricultural sector to reduce reliance on imported food. Mali followed a similar path, forging new trade alliances and reclaiming control over its mining industry, which had long been dominated by Western corporations. Niger, which expelled French troops and revoked uranium contracts that heavily favored France, took steps toward strengthening its energy independence. These cases proved a crucial point. A post-France economy was not just possible, it was working. None of these countries had collapsed without French economic support, as Western analysts had predicted. Instead, they were forging new paths toward economic independence, cutting out exploitative middlemen and keeping more of their wealth within their borders. This was Chad's blueprint for the future. Instead of remaining a resource hub for France, where its wealth was extracted and sent abroad, it would become an independent economic force in Africa. It would trade on its terms with partners that respected its sovereignty and with industries that benefited its people. The days of Chad being a financial outpost for France were over. The new Chad would not ask for permission to thrive. Do you think the West finally needs to accept its fate? Will they stop exploiting Africa, or they must be thrown out? Let us know in the comment section. Can anything stop African nations from ending ties with the West? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.